The observation deck buzzed with excitement as alien creatures from across the galaxy pressed closer to the massive viewing screens. Their eyes, some with multiple pupils and others glowing with bioluminescence, fixed on the scene unfolding below. In the center of it all stood the Crucible, an enormous biodome that stretched for miles, filled with jagged mountains, deep valleys, and an artificial purple sky that cast everything in an eerie twilight. A mechanical voice cut through the chatter. Subject identified, human male, designation Miho, age 32 standard cycles. The aliens leaned forward with anticipation. Some clicked their mandibles. Others released excited pheromones that filled the air with strange scents. They had all placed their bets, and now the show was about to begin. Below, inside the Crucible, Miho felt the transport platform vanish beneath his boots. For a moment he was weightless, then his feet hit solid rock. He stumbled forward, catching himself with his hands against the rough stone. The impact sent a jolt up his arms, but he barely noticed. His mind was already racing, trying to understand where he was and what had happened. The last thing Miho remembered was exploring an unmarked region of space. His small research vessel had picked up unusual biological readings, the kind that made a xenobiologist's heart race with excitement. He had moved closer to investigate, following proper survey protocols, marking his position, recording everything. Then the consortium ships had appeared, surrounding him like predators circling prey. There had been no discussion. No trial. No chance to explain himself. Just cold, alien faces staring at him through video screens, pronouncing his sentence in a language his translator barely understood. Trespassing in forbidden territory. Punishment, the Crucible. Survive or perish. Now he stood alone on a rocky outcrop, and the air tasted wrong. It was thick with the smell of sulfur and ash, like standing near an active volcano. The sky above was not the black of space or the blue of Earth, but a deep purple that seemed to pulse with its own light. Mountains rose around him like the teeth of some massive beast, their peaks lost in artificial clouds. Miho forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic would kill him faster than anything else in this place. He had survived worse situations before, back on Earth, before he ever dreamed of traveling to the stars. 20 years ago, he had been a different person, teaching survival skills in the mountains of Kangwon province. City people would come to learn how to build fires, find water, read the landscape. He had taught them that nature was not their enemy, just something that operated by different rules. He checked his equipment. The aliens had given him a pack, which was something at least. Inside he found a water purifier, a thermal blanket, a knife with a 6-inch blade, and 3 days' worth of rations. The rations were standard consortium issue, dense nutrient blocks that tasted like cardboard but would keep him alive. 3 days. That was how long they expected him to last. A sound echoed across the valley, deep and primal. It vibrated in his chest, in his bones, in the rock beneath his feet. Miho had heard recordings of many creatures from many worlds, but nothing quite like this. It was a roar, but there was something musical about it, something that spoke of intelligence behind the raw power. He scanned the sky and saw it. A shadow against the purple light, wings that stretched wider than his research vessel, a body covered in scales that caught the light like polished metal. The creature banked in a wide circle, its massive head turning as it searched for something. For him. Above, in the observation deck, the aliens were placing their final bets. An insectoid creature with multiple limbs clicked its mandibles in amusement. 4 hours maximum. Humans are weak, soft things. Another alien, this one resembling a mass of tentacles and eyes, burbled its response. You are too generous, friend. I give the human 2 hours. The Draconis Rex are perfect killing machines. They have never failed to eliminate their prey. A third alien, covered in crystalline growths that reflected light in rainbow patterns, chimed in. Perhaps we should have given the human a weapon. At least make the entertainment last longer. They all laughed, each species producing its own unique sound of amusement. Below, Miho watched the dragon circle lower. It was searching for him, testing the air with each pass. He could see the intelligence in the way it moved, the careful calculation of each wing beat, the methodical search pattern. Miho's hand rested on the knife at his belt, but he knew it was useless against something that size. This was not a situation he could fight his way out of. He would need to think, to observe, to understand. The aliens expected him to run, to hide, to eventually die screaming. He had other plans. 5 days had passed since Miho was dropped into the Crucible, and he was still breathing. This fact alone had caused confusion among the consortium observers. The betting pools had closed. The entertainment value had shifted into something else entirely. Now the aliens watched not for sport, but with genuine curiosity and growing concern. Commander Tavik stood at the main viewing screen, his reptilian eyes tracking the human's movements through the biodome. His scales were a deep green that darkened when he was troubled, and right now they were nearly black. Behind him, his science officer, a creature with too many joints in its limbs and a head that rotated in ways that defied biology, studied the data streams. "He is studying them," Tavik said, his voice carrying the hiss common to his species. "Look at his patterns. He is not simply surviving. He is learning." The science officer's head tilted at an impossible angle. "That cannot be correct, Commander. Humans lack the cognitive framework for xenobiology of this complexity. Their brains are small, inefficient. They rely on emotions rather than logic. The data clearly shows." "Then your data is wrong," Tavik interrupted. "Watch." On the screen, Miho crouched behind a boulder near a dried riverbed. He had been there for over an hour, completely still, barely breathing. In his hand was a stick, and in the dirt before him were crude drawings. Lines and symbols that meant nothing to the casual observer but everything to someone taking notes. 3 dragons approached the water source from different directions. The largest, a female with scales that shimmered like copper in the artificial light, arrived first. She was massive, easily 20 feet from nose to tail, with wings that could create windstorms when fully extended. She drank deeply, her long neck dipping to the water while her eyes constantly scanned for threats. 2 smaller males arrived next. They kept their distance from the female, their heads lowered in what was clearly a submissive posture. They waited until she finished drinking before approaching the water themselves. Even then they kept glancing at her, making sure they had permission. Miho watched all of this, his stick moving across the dirt, creating more symbols and drawings. He was mapping their behavior, their hierarchy, the social rules that govern their interactions. The science officer zoomed in on Miho's drawings. "What is he recording?" "Everything," Tavik replied. "Body language, vocalizations, territorial markers. In 5 days, this human has learned more about the Draconis Rex than our research teams learned in 5 years." It was true. Over the past days, Miho had covered incredible ground. He had found the scorch marks on rocks and trees where dragons marked their territory with fire. He had discovered their preferred hunting grounds by following the bones of their prey. He had identified 4 separate dragon groups, each with their own territory and hierarchy. Most importantly, he had learned their schedule. Dragons hunted at dawn and dusk when the artificial light was dimmest. They rested during the brightest parts of the day in caves and under rock overhangs. They were most active near water sources every 3 days, which meant water was scarce enough to be valuable. Miho used all of this information to stay alive. He moved through their territories when they were resting. He avoided water sources during their active periods. He never stayed in one place long enough to be found. It was like a complicated dance and he was learning the steps. But he had noticed something else, something the consortium had apparently missed in all their years of observation. There was a 4th dragon at this water source, one that hung back in the shadows. It was smaller than the others, its scales dull and covered in scars. It did not approach the water until all the others had left. Even then, it moved with hesitation, constantly looking around as if expecting an attack. An outcast. Every social group had one. Miho had seen it in wolf packs back on Earth, in primate groups, in human communities. When animals formed hierarchies, there were always those at the bottom, those pushed to the edges. Over the next 2 days, Miho focused his attention on this scarred dragon. He tracked its movements, learned its patterns, discovered where it slept and what it ate. And then he did something that made the consortium observers freeze in shock. He left food for it. From his own rations, Miho took small portions of the dense protein blocks and placed them in locations where the scarred dragon would find them. He did not hide. He stayed visible at a distance, letting the creature see him, letting it associate his presence with something positive rather than threatening. The first time, the dragon ignored the food, circling it suspiciously before leaving. The second time, it sniffed the offering but did not eat. The third time, after Miho had moved away to a safe distance, the dragon consumed the food in 3 quick bites. In the observation deck, alarms began to sound, not from any malfunction, but from the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. "He is attempting domestication," the science officer said, its voice rising in pitch. "This violates all protocols. We must terminate the experiment immediately." But Tavik raised a clawed hand for silence. His dark scales had lightened slightly, a sign of fascination. "No. Let it continue. I want to see what happens next. Commander, this is dangerous. If the human successfully bonds with a Draconis Rex, then we will learn something new," Tavik said. Is that not the purpose of science? The dragon that Miho named Bori had scars scattered across its hide like frozen hailstones, which is what the name meant in Korean. Over the following week, something impossible happened in the crucible. The outcast dragon and the trapped human formed a bond that defied everything the consortium understood about both species. It started with trust. Bori had been eating the food Miho left for 3 days straight. Each time the dragon came a little closer, stayed a little longer, showed a little less fear. On the 8th day, Miho sat on a flat rock with food in his hand instead of leaving it on the ground. He did not move, barely breathe, just waited. Bori approached slowly, each step careful and measured. The dragon's copper scales, dull from illness and neglect, caught the purple light of the artificial sky. When Bori was close enough that Miho could feel the heat radiating from its body, the dragon stopped. Its nostrils flared, testing his scent. Then, gently, almost delicately for a creature so large, Bori took the food from Miho's open palm. That was the moment everything changed. Up close, Miho could see what the consortium observers had missed from their distant screens. Bori was sick. The scars were not just from fights or accidents. They were from parasites, tiny creatures that had burrowed under the dragon's scales, creating infected wounds that wept and festered. The pain must have been constant, unbearable. "That is why you are so angry," Miho whispered in Korean, his voice soft and sad. "You are hurting all the time." He remembered his first aid kit. Inside was antiseptic, bandages, basic medical supplies. He also remembered seeing certain plants in the biodome, plants with leaves that looked similar to ones he knew from Earth. Plants that might have healing properties. Over the next several days, Miho became a doctor to a dragon. He gathered the medicinal plants, crushing their leaves into paste. He used his precious antiseptic sparingly, mixing it with water to make it last longer. And then, with Bori watching him with those intelligent eyes, he began treating the wounds. The first touch made Bori flinch and growl, a sound that rumbled deep in the dragon's chest like distant thunder. But Miho kept his movements slow and gentle, talking constantly in a calm voice even though Bori could not understand the words. Tone mattered more than meaning. The dragon seemed to sense that the brief sting of treatment was connected to relief from the constant burning pain. As the infections healed, something remarkable happened. Bori changed. The dullness faded from the dragon's scales, replaced by a healthy shine. The dragon's eyes, which had been clouded and dim, became bright and alert. But most importantly, the aggression that everyone assumed was natural to the species began to disappear. Bori became playful. The dragon would bring Miho interesting rocks or make mock charges that ended in sliding stops, waiting for Miho's reaction. It was like watching a giant, scaly puppy discovering joy for the first time. And Bori began to talk. Not with words, but with sounds that clearly carried meaning. There were low rumbles that vibrated through the ground, sounds that Miho came to understand meant contentment or greeting. There were sharp chirps, quick and high-pitched, that seemed to mean pay attention, or look at this. There were hisses that indicated danger, growls that showed displeasure, and a particular trill that Miho swore was the dragon equivalent of laughter. Miho started keeping a journal, writing down each sound and what situation it occurred in. He began to respond with his own sounds, trying to mimic the dragon's vocalizations. His human throat could not produce exactly the same tones, but Bori seemed to understand he was trying to communicate. 3 short chirps meant come closer. A long, low rumble meant, I am here, everything is safe. A quick hiss followed by a chirp meant, danger nearby, be careful. By the end of the second week, Miho did something that sent shock waves through every observation deck in the consortium fleet. He climbed onto Bori's back. The dragon crouched low, making it easier for the human to mount. Miho gripped the ridge of scales along Bori's spine, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and excitement. Then Bori stood, and with 3 running steps and a powerful downward thrust of wings, they were airborne. Flying was nothing like Miho had imagined. It was not smooth or gentle. It was raw power, wind screaming past his face, his stomach dropping as Bori banked and turned. But it was also freedom. For the first time since being thrown into this prison, Miho felt like he had some control over his fate. They soared over the crucible, and from this height, Miho could see other dragons watching them. The alpha female, massive and scarred from countless battles, stood on a high peak, her head tracking their flight. Other dragons emerged from caves and hiding spots, their attention fixed on the impossible sight of dragon and human moving as one. In the observation deck, Commander Tavik watched with growing dread. His science officer stood beside him, all of its joints locked in what might have been fear or fascination. "Commander," the science officer said, its voice barely functioning. What do we do? Tavik's scales had gone completely black. We have made a terrible mistake. Miho found the maintenance panel by pure chance. He had been exploring the eastern section of the crucible, riding on Bori's back, when he noticed something unusual. A section of rock wall that did not quite match the others, too smooth, too uniform. When he pressed against it, the panel slid open, revealing blinking lights and alien text. His translator device, the one the consortium had left functional so he could understand their initial sentence, flickered to life. Most of the text was technical gibberish, system diagnostics and power readings. But one line made his blood run cold. Sterilization protocol, 47 hours, 23 minutes. Miho stared at the countdown, watching the minutes tick down. Sterilization. The word was clinical, cold, designed to hide what it really meant. They were going to kill everything in the crucible. Bori all the dragons. They would flood the biodome with poison gas or maybe just vent all the atmosphere into space. Clean and efficient. His hands shook with rage and fear. They had never intended to let him survive. This was always the plan. Put him in the arena, watch the show, then dispose of all the evidence when it became inconvenient. Bori sensed his distress and made a low, worried rumble. Miho pressed his forehead against the dragon's warm scales and forced himself to breathe, to think. 47 hours. 2 days to find a way out or die trying. Over the past weeks, Miho had not just bonded with Bori. He had been quietly treating other dragons, using the same methods that had healed his partner. The parasites that infected them were not natural to their species. Miho had figured that out by studying the creatures under a makeshift microscope he built from salvaged drone parts. The infections were too uniform, too widespread. Someone had introduced them deliberately. The consortium had tortured these dragons to make them aggressive, to turn them into the perfect monsters for their arena. Now there were 12 dragons that Miho had treated and befriended. 12 dragons that were healthy, coordinated, and increasingly loyal to the human who had given them relief from years of pain. It was not enough to fight an entire alien fleet, but it might be enough to survive. Miho gathered them all in a large clearing near the central water source. The alpha female, whom he had named Nabi after the Korean word for butterfly because of her surprising grace despite her size, arrived first. She had been the hardest to approach, the most suspicious but also the most intelligent. Once she understood that Miho wanted to help rather than harm, she had become his strongest ally. The other dragons followed. Some were still nervous around him, but they trusted Nabi and Nabi trusted Miho. That was enough. Using rocks and sticks, Miho drew in the dirt. He was not an artist, but he did not need to be. He drew simple shapes, circles for the biodome, triangles for the consortium ships above, lines showing directions and movements. He drew the maintenance tunnels he had discovered, the weak points in the structure, the observation drones that watched their every move. The dragons watched him work, their heads tilting as they tried to understand. Miho supplemented the drawings with the vocal commands they had learned together. 3 sharp chirps for attack. A long, low rumble for wait. A complex series of sounds that meant work together. He pointed at the countdown timer on his salvaged device, then at the drawings, then at the sky above. The message was clear: fight or die. No other options remained. Nabi made a sound Miho had never heard before, a deep resonant call that echoed across the valley. One by one the other dragons responded, each adding their voice to the chorus. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, a declaration of defiance that made the artificial sky seem to tremble. Bori moved close to Miho and chirped a question, the tone rising at the end, seeking clarification. The sound meant, how, or what next, or maybe just, are you sure? Dragons could pack a lot of meaning into a single vocalization. Miho placed his hand on Bori's scarred muzzle, feeling the heat of the dragon's breath, the trust that had grown between them. Together, he said in Korean, then repeated it in the rumbling approximation of dragon speech he had learned. We do this together. The next 47 hours would determine if they lived or died. But Miho had learned something important during his time in the Crucible. The consortium had made a critical mistake. They thought they were trapping a human with monsters. They did not understand that humans had been turning monsters into allies for thousands of years. It was what humans did best. Dogs had once been wolves. Horses had been wild and dangerous. Even cats, those independent creatures, had chosen to live alongside humans because the partnership benefited both sides. Now Miho had dragons. And the consortium was about to learn why that was a very bad thing for them. The consortium's security forces entered the Crucible with confidence. 20 soldiers, all heavily armed with plasma weapons and energy shields, marched through the main access tunnel. They had orders to eliminate all subjects in the biodome before the human fleet arrived. Commander Tavik wanted this problem erased, the evidence destroyed, the embarrassment buried. They made it exactly 300 meters before the first dragon struck. Nabi descended from above like a meteor wrapped in scales and fury. Her massive claws caught two soldiers, lifting them into the air and dropping them from a height that left them unconscious but alive. She did not kill them. Miho had been very specific about that. No deaths unless absolutely necessary. The goal was escape, not revenge. The remaining soldiers scattered, trying to establish defensive positions, but the terrain worked against them. This was the dragon's home. They knew every cave, every cliff, every hiding spot. More dragons appeared, attacking from multiple directions in coordinated strikes that the soldiers' training had never prepared them for. Because the training assumed mindless beasts, not intelligent creatures working with tactical precision under human guidance. Miho watched from a high ridge, his salvaged communicator allowing him to hear the soldiers' panicked transmissions. They are everywhere. They are working together. The human has weaponized them. Fall back, their squad leader screamed. Fall back to the entrance. But Bori and 3 other dragons had already circled behind them, cutting off their escape. The soldiers found themselves trapped in a canyon with dragons above and dragons behind. Some dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Others tried to fight, their plasma bolts scorching dragon scales but not penetrating deep enough to cause serious injury. In the command center, Tavik watched his forces crumble in real time. His scales had turned almost white with stress. How is this possible? They are animals. His science officer for once had no answer. The data made no sense. Individual dragons were dangerous but predictable. 12 dragons working as a coordinated unit under human direction was something else entirely, something new and terrifying. Then every screen in the command center flickered and changed. Miho's face appeared, dirty and exhausted but wearing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I know you can hear me," he said in accented consortium standard, the language he had learned from their own computer interfaces over the past weeks. "I know what you did to these creatures. I know you are planning to kill us all to hide your crimes." Tavik moved to cut the transmission, but his controls were locked. The human had somehow hacked into their systems. "I have been broadcasting everything on all frequencies," Miho continued. "Every moment since you threw me in here. My ship's automated distress beacon has been active this entire time, and you were stupid enough to leave it running. That beacon has been transmitting to a human scout fleet for 19 days. The command center fell silent. No one had thought to check for human ships in the area. Why would they? Earth was far away and humans were not considered a threat. "They arrive in 30 minutes, Miho said. "So here is your choice. Release us, provide reparations for what you did to these dragons, and maybe we avoid an interstellar incident. Or keep trying to kill us and explain to Earth's diplomats why you imprisoned, tortured, and murdered one of their citizens." The transmission ended, leaving Tavik staring at a blank screen. 28 minutes later, 3 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. They were smaller than consortium vessels but moved with aggressive purpose, weapons armed, shields raised. "This is Captain Jisu of the Earth vessel Indomitable," a voice broadcast on every diplomatic channel. "We are here for our citizen. And we are not leaving without him." The Consortium Council convened in emergency session, representatives from dozens of species gathering via holographic projection. Tavik presented his case, his voice steady despite his stress. The human had trespassed in forbidden space. He had weaponized dangerous creatures. He had compromised consortium security. Captain Jisu's response was broadcast directly into the council chamber, her image appearing above the central table. She was young for a ship captain, maybe 40 standard years, with black hair tied back and eyes that had seen combat. "You imprisoned a civilian scientist," she said, her voice cold and clear. "You forced him into gladiatorial combat with creatures you deliberately infected to increase their aggression. You planned to execute him when he survived longer than expected. Do you really want to discuss this in front of the Galactic Court?" The council chamber erupted in argument. Some species were outraged at the consortium's actions. Others worried about the political implications. A few simply wanted the problem to disappear before it got worse. 3 hours of negotiation followed. In the end, Earth's position was clear and non-negotiable. Return Miho unharmed, compensate him for his suffering, provide sanctuary for the dragons, or face economic sanctions and potential military action. Humanity had been quietly building alliances across the galaxy for the past 50 years. The consortium could not afford to lose those relationships over one illegal arena. The biodome doors opened for the first time in centuries. Miho walked out with 12 dragons at his back. Bori walked at his right side, Nabi at his left. The consortium soldiers who had fought them just hours before now stood at attention, watching in respectful silence as the impossible procession passed. Captain Jisoo met him at the shuttle bay. She looked at Miho, then at the dragons, then back at Miho. "You have caused quite the diplomatic incident." "They started it," Miho replied. "Fair point." She glanced at the dragons again. "And them? They come with me. Non-negotiable." Jisoo smiled. "Earth is offering a sanctuary colony. New Jeju. Plenty of space, good climate, no interference. You will have full authority over their care." "Not care," Miho corrected gently. "Partnership. They are not pets or subjects. They are people." "Understood." As the shuttle lifted off, carrying humans and dragons toward freedom, a consortium diplomat approached Tavik on the observation deck. "Explain to me how one human became more dangerous than 12 apex predators," the diplomat said quietly. Tavik watched the shuttle disappear into the stars, his scales slowly returning to their normal green color. "We assumed danger meant teeth and claws and fire," he said. "We forgot that intelligence is the real apex predator. And humans have a gift. They turn enemies into allies. They turn prisons into fortresses. They turn impossible situations into victories." He paused. "We did not trap a human with dragons. We gave him an army and a reason to fight. That is humanity's true danger." 6 months later, on New Jeju, Miho stood with Bori watching Nabi's eggs hatch. The young dragons played in mountain streams while their parents watched over them. A researcher named Hannah approached with a tablet. "The consortium wants to meet. Something about cooperation protocols for other imprisoned species." Miho smiled and scratched under Bori's chin. "Tell them we will consider it. On our terms."